What if America's worst nightmare isn't losing a war, but losing Europe, because of a place most people can't even find on a map? A trade deal that took years to build just hit a wall. Not because of a scandal. Not because of an election. Not because of a war. Because the European Parliament just halted the ratification of the U.S.-EU trade deal, right after Donald Trump imposed new 10% tariffs on 8 EU countries, tariffs that are being described as Greenland-linked. And that phrase is the clue. Because Greenland-linked doesn't sound like normal trade policy. It sounds like a message, a signal, a threat disguised as a spreadsheet. Here's what most people don't understand about moments like this. The damage doesn't start when prices go up. The damage starts when trust goes down. When trust breaks, companies pause. Orders freeze. Factories wait. And money, smart money, moves first. And now, the biggest economic partnership on Earth is suddenly acting like it might not have a future. So the real question is not, who's right? The real question is, what happens next, when Europe decides it can't depend on America anymore? Because if Europe flips that switch, America's worst nightmare isn't a headline. It's a chain reaction. And it's already starting. In this video, you're going to see why Greenland is even part of the story, why the EU hit pause so hard, and what comes next that most people won't notice until it's too late to stop. Why would tariffs on 8 European countries be tied to Greenland at all? What does Greenland have that can shake the US and Europe? Most people hear Greenland and think ice, snow, polar bears, maybe climate change. But governments don't stare at Greenland because it's pretty. They stare at Greenland because it's positioned like a lock on a door. A door that leads to 3 things that decide the future. 1. New shipping routes. 2. Military reach and radar coverage. 3. Critical minerals. And if you control those, you control leverage. Let's make it simple. For decades, global trade has relied on a few predictable routes. Predictable routes create stable prices. Stable prices create stable politics. Now the Arctic is changing. Routes that used to be impossible are becoming seasonally usable. And suddenly geography, old school geography, is back. That means Greenland stops being remote. It becomes central. So when you hear Greenland-linked tariffs, don't picture a small trade argument. Picture a pressure point. Because the moment trade policy gets linked to a strategic location, the fight is no longer about trade. It's about control. But here's the twist. This is where the story gets weird. Europe's response wasn't just angry. It was immediate. The European Parliament didn't say, "Let's talk." They said, "Stop. Halt ratification." That's not a normal reaction to only 10%. So why did they move like they saw a bigger threat? To answer that, you have to understand what tariffs really do behind the scenes. Not on Twitter. In real life. Imagine you run a company in Europe that builds high-end machinery. Stuff America buys because it's the best. Your contracts are signed months in advance. Your parts come from 3 countries. Your shipping schedule is timed down to the week. Then you wake up and see 10% tariffs. And not evenly across Europe. Not predictable. Not temporary in a way you can trust. Just new rules. Your first thought isn't, "We'll pay more." Your first thought is, what else is coming? Because when tariffs are tied to something strategic, like Greenland, it tells you the rules can change again. And once businesses believe the rules can change again, they stop investing like the future is stable. They invest like the future is hostile. They delay hiring. They delay expansion. They renegotiate supply contracts. They start looking for alternatives that don't rely on the relationship. That's why Europe didn't react like this was a simple trade disagreement. They reacted like they just saw the first crack in the bridge. And when a bridge cracks, you don't keep driving trucks over it. You shut it down. So why Greenland? Because Greenland represents the next era of power, routes, minerals, and leverage. And the moment tariffs get linked to that kind of power play, Europe stops treating the US like a guaranteed partner and starts treating the US like a variable. That's what just happened. And once a partner becomes a variable, the next question becomes terrifying. What happens when Europe decides it needs a backup plan for America? Why would the European Parliament halt the entire trade deal ratification over a 10% tariff? What are they afraid of? To understand the EU reaction, you have to understand something uncomfortable. Europe is not one country. It's an alliance. And alliances run on one fuel more than anything else. When the US imposes tariffs on 8 EU countries, especially with a Greenland label attached, Europe hears something deeper than 10%. Europe hears, this is targeted. This is strategic. This can be escalated. This can be repeated. And that creates a problem inside Europe that most Americans never have to think about. Because Europe's first crisis isn't with America. Europe's first crisis is with Europe. If only 8 countries get hit, then Europe has to answer brutal questions. Should we retaliate as one bloc if only some got hurt? If we don't retaliate, do those 8 countries feel abandoned? If we do retaliate, do other countries pay the price for a fight they didn't start? That's how an outside pressure becomes an inside fracture. And once Europe starts fracturing internally, the trade deal becomes political poison. Because ratifying that deal now looks like rewarding pressure. And politicians don't like rewarding pressure. They like to look strong. Especially on camera. Think about ratification like a marriage license. Negotiators can spend years drafting it. But ratification is the moment you sign it in public. And you don't sign a marriage license while the other person is threatening to raise the rent. That's the vibe. So the European Parliament halting ratification is Europe saying, we are not moving forward until we know what game this is. Because if this is a trade dispute, it can be negotiated. But if this is a strategic pressure campaign, ratification becomes a trap. And here's what makes it worse. A modern US-EU trade deal isn't just about tariffs. It's about the future rules for electric vehicles, digital services, industrial standards, supply chain security, data movement, government procurement, energy and climate tech. So halting ratification doesn't just pause a paper. It pauses the future rules of the world's richest economic lane. And now, everyone starts making decisions in the dark. And decisions made in the dark tend to be defensive. So why did the EU hit the brakes? Because targeted tariffs with a strategic label don't feel like policy. They feel like leverage. And Europe is terrified of one outcome: signing a future with America, while America is proving it can rewrite the terms overnight. Once that fear shows up, everything changes. Including the one thing America has relied on for decades: Europe defaulting to America. And when Europe stops defaulting to America, that's the nightmare. Now we need to talk about what that nightmare really is, because it's not what most people think. What is America's worst nightmare in this situation? And why would a trade pause in Brussels be more dangerous than a loud political fight? Most people assume America's worst nightmare is simple. Europe gets mad. That's not it. America can handle Europe being mad. America's worst nightmare is something quieter. Europe stops needing America. Because as long as Europe's economic system is tied closely to America's, the US has something priceless. A built-in partner block. Shared standards. Shared supply chains. Shared strategic alignment. But if Europe decides it needs strategic independence from the US, real independence, not just talking points, then the world changes. And it changes in ways that don't show up as one big event. It shows up as 1,000 small switches flipping. Here are the switches that start flipping when trust breaks. Switch number 1, supply chains. European companies stop building supply chains that depend on smooth U.S. access. They redesign products. They choose different vendors. They move manufacturing. Switch number 2, standards. Europe starts pushing its own standards harder. Different charging systems. Different compliance rules. Different data rules. That sounds boring until you realize standards decide who dominates industries. Switch number 3, payments and finance. When alliances wobble, finance looks for safety. Businesses want deals that can't be frozen, blocked, or politicized. Switch number 4, defense procurement and tech. Europe starts buying and building more. European first. Not because they hate America, because they hate uncertainty. And once those switches flip, you can't just unflip them with a handshake, because money will have already moved. Factories will already be under construction. Contracts will already be signed. That's why this is bigger than a tariff. Tariffs are reversible. But a relationship downgrade? That becomes the new default. And defaults shape decades. So what's America's worst nightmare? It's not a short-term trade fight. It's Europe making a long-term decision that says, we can't build our future on U.S. stability. Because if Europe builds a backup plan for America, America loses the luxury of being the center of the Western economic system by default. And once that happens, the U.S. doesn't just lose exports. It loses influence. Which brings us to the next chapter, because influence doesn't disappear politely. It gets fought over. And the next phase of this fight won't look like tariffs. It will look like something most people never see coming until it hits their bank account. If this escalates, what breaks first? And why will regular people feel it before politicians admit anything is wrong? Here's the trap with modern trade wars. The first visible damage is never the real damage. The first visible damage is price. But the real damage is rhythm. Trade runs on rhythm. Ships, schedules, parts, payments. When the rhythm breaks, everything gets clumsy. And clumsy is expensive. Let's walk through the chain reaction in plain English. Step 1. Companies pause. They don't know if the 10% stays. They don't know if it becomes 20%. They don't know if it expands to more countries. They don't know if Europe retaliates. So they wait. Waiting sounds harmless. But waiting is where shortages are born. Step 2. Companies reroute. If you're a big company, you don't gamble on politics calming down. You shift risk. You move production. You change suppliers. You stockpile parts. You redesign logistics. That costs money. And that cost gets passed down. Step 3. Governments escalate quietly. Not with speeches. With rules. Extra inspections. Longer approval times. New security reviews. New compliance requirements. That's how trade wars become tech wars without anyone announcing it. Because if you slow the flow of key components, you don't need a headline. The effects show up in product launches, construction delays, and hiring freezes. Step 4. The public feels it. And the public doesn't feel it as trade policy. They feel it as, why is my car insurance higher? Why did my phone get more expensive? Why is my energy bill up again? Why are layoffs suddenly happening? Then politics gets louder. And louder politics makes business even more nervous. That's the spiral. People think global trade is just stuff moving. But global trade is credit. A lot of trade runs on trust-based financing, letters of credit, insurance, future contracts. When uncertainty rises, financing gets tighter. When financing gets tighter, small companies get crushed first. And when small companies get crushed, job losses start in places you wouldn't expect. Trucking, warehousing, mid-sized manufacturing, local suppliers, port services, even advertising and retail. That's why this isn't just a Europe story. This is a regular life story. Because the US and EU are not small players. They are a massive part of the global machine. When they stop cooperating, the machine doesn't stop. It grinds. And grinding means heat. Heat means cost. So what breaks first? Not diplomacy. Planning. The first thing to break is companies' ability to plan confidently across the Atlantic. And once planning breaks, investment breaks. Once investment breaks, jobs get shaky. And once jobs get shaky, politics gets extreme. That's how a trade deal pause turns into something that changes daily life. But we still haven't answered the most important question. Why does Greenland keep showing up like a ghost in this story? Because Greenland isn't the reason. It's the signal for what this is really about. And the final chapter is where that becomes clear. If this is bigger than tariffs, what is the real endgame? And what happens next that most people won't notice until the future is already locked in? When a major trade deal gets halted, there are two futures. Future A is the one everyone hopes for. A few meetings. A compromise. A calm headline. Future B is the one serious people plan for. A slow split that never fully heals. And here's the rule. If both sides start preparing for Future B becomes more likely. Because preparation changes reality. So let's talk about what the next phase looks like. Not in theory, but in behavior. Europe doesn't need to announce war to respond. It can respond with targeted countermeasures, regulatory pressure, delaying approvals, tightening standards, redirecting investment. At the same time, U.S. companies start hedging. They'll ask, do we build the next plant in America or somewhere else? Do we prioritize non-EU suppliers? Do we shift to markets that feel politically safer? And while leaders argue in public, supply chains start drifting in private. This is the point where the future hardens. Because contracts get signed on 3-year and 5-year cycles. And when companies rewrite contracts, they don't do it for fun. They do it because they think the risk is real. That means new supplier networks, new shipping insurance assumptions, new factory decisions, new trusted partner lists. And once those are in place, even if the tariffs disappear later, the trust doesn't magically come back. This is the part that people miss until it's already normal. The default changes. And when defaults change, it feels like the world just became like this. But it didn't just become anything. It was built quietly, step by step, while everyone was distracted by the headline fight. So let's bring Greenland back, because this is the center of the mystery. Greenland-linked tariffs are not really about punishing 8 countries. They are about reminding the EU that strategic geography can be turned into economic pressure. It's the same logic as energy leverage. The same logic as choke points. The same logic as supply control. And once that logic enters the US-EU relationship, the relationship is no longer a comfortable default. It becomes a negotiation every day. That is exhausting. And exhausted partners don't build a future together. They build exit ramps. So what's about to happen? If this doesn't get resolved fast and clean, you're going to see Europe accelerate its independence plans in industry, tech rules, and strategic sourcing. Companies redesign supply chains away from the Atlantic bridge. A slow rise in costs that doesn't feel connected to one cause, but hits everything. A new kind of economic Cold War where paperwork and standards do the damage instead of missiles. And a world where partners act more like rivals because the trust is gone. And that is America's worst nightmare. Not losing one fight. Losing the assumption that Europe will always line up with the US when it matters. Because once that assumption dies, America doesn't just face competitors overseas. It faces a world where even friends keep a hand on the exit door. And the scary part? This can happen without a single dramatic moment. No sirens. No countdown clock. Just a series of quiet decisions that lock the future into place. If this story felt confusing, it's because the headline is hiding the real battlefield. The battlefield isn't tariffs. It's maps. It's resources. It's routes. And Greenland is the symbol of that shift, because whoever controls Arctic access and critical materials can pressure entire economies without firing a shot. That's why the next video matters. So hype and subscribe to our channel.